Halloween night has always been a special kind of eerie. The costumes, the decorations, the way the air turns colder, crisper. There's an energy to it, a kind of pulse that makes you feel like the veil between the living and the dead is just a little thinner. But what happened to me that night, just a couple of years ago, was more than just Halloween ambience. It was something real, something I still can't quite explain. I remember it well. I was with my friends Alex, Jamie, and Sophia. We were all in our mid-20s, too old for trick-or-treating, but still drawn to the magic of the night. We decided to meet at Jamie's place, which sat at the end of 32 Elm Street, a street known in our town for its spooky history. Rumor had it that a witch once lived there in the 1800s, and though it had long been debunked, the legend persisted. As kids, we'd dare each other to walk down the street at night, but I always avoided it. Now, it seemed childish to let an old story scare me. The plan was simple: horror movies, snacks, and drinks. But as I walked up to Jamie's front door, I noticed something unusual. A black cat was sitting on the porch, staring at me with glowing green eyes. Not an uncommon sight on Halloween, sure, but this cat was different. It didn't flinch, didn't move, just stared. Its gaze was intense, almost too intense. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Hey, do you know whose cat that is?" I asked Jamie once I got inside. The others were already there, comfortably settled on the couch. Jamie shrugged. "I've seen it around the neighborhood. It's probably just a stray." We didn't think much of it at first. We settled in, watching a series of old horror flicks while the wind howled outside. The house creaked and groaned with the kind of noises that seemed to sync perfectly with the jump scares on screen. Everything felt like a typical Halloween night until the knocking started. At first, it was soft, barely audible. We all dismissed it as the wind, but then it grew louder, more insistent. A slow, deliberate knock dash knock dash knock. Alex, being the bravest of the bunch, got up to check the door. "There's no one there," he said, peering outside. "Probably just some kids messing around." But the knocking continued, and with each round, it felt closer, as if it was moving from the front door to the windows, then back again. The cat was still there on the porch, staring in through the glass. The knocking seemed to seep through everything. It grew louder, more demanding. The cat was gone from the porch now, and that made me more nervous than if it had still been there. "I think we should check outside," Alex finally said, grabbing a flashlight. None of us wanted to be the first to admit we were scared, so we all followed him out onto the porch. The wind had picked up, swirling dead leaves around our feet. The street was eerily quiet, not a trick-or-treater in sight. For a moment, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then I saw it. The cat was standing at the end of the driveway, staring at us. Its fur bristled, and its eyes were glowing even brighter than before. But there was something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat. Behind the cat, a figure loomed. Tall, shadowy, with no distinguishable features, just a dark silhouette against the night. It was standing still, watching us. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Alex nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. He shined it toward the figure, but the light seemed to dissolve before it could reach it, swallowed by the darkness. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, but the knocking started again, this time louder, more aggressive. But it wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from inside our heads, reverberating in our skulls like some twisted heartbeat. We all backed up instinctively, retreating toward the house. The cat hissed, and the figure seemed to dissolve into the wind, but the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more painful, like 1,000 nails being driven into our minds. "We need to get inside," Jamie shouted, pulling the door open. We stumbled in, slamming it shut behind us. The knocking stopped abruptly. Silence, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, that feels almost deafening. We huddled together in the living room, none of us speaking for what felt like an eternity. The house was still. The wind outside seemed to have died down, and for a moment, it was as if nothing had happened at all. But then we heard it, the soft sound of purring. The black cat was sitting on the windowsill, inside the house now, staring at us with those glowing green eyes. We never spoke about that night again. There's something inherently eerie about Halloween in small towns. It's a night when everything feels just a bit too quiet, where the shadows seem to stretch longer, and the wind whispers secrets you're not sure you want to hear. I've never been one to spook easily, but there's one Halloween night I'll never forget, one that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. It was a crisp, moonlit evening, and the air was heavy with the scent of fallen leaves and distant bonfires. My friends Jake, Emily, and I had decided to spend the night exploring Pumpkin Hollow, an old, abandoned farm on the outskirts of our town. The farm had a reputation, you see. Locals whispered stories about it, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was said to be paper-thin on Halloween night. We'd heard the tales growing up. The farmer, Old Man Grayson, had been a recluse, living alone in the decaying house at the center of the farm. They said he dabbled in dark rituals, trying to communicate with the other side. He disappeared one Halloween night, and no one ever saw him again. The farm had been left to rot, but every year, kids dared each other to venture into Pumpkin Hollow after dark. Most didn't go further than the rusted gate, but we weren't most kids. Jake, always the brave one, pushed open the creaky gate, its rusty hinges screaming in protest. The three of us slipped through, the moon casting our long shadows on the overgrown path leading to the farmhouse. The wind picked up as we approached, carrying with it the faintest sound of something moving. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, clutching my arm. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound confident. But truth be told, I felt it too, the sense that we weren't alone. The farmhouse loomed before us, dark and foreboding. The windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar, creaking slightly as it swayed in the breeze. We stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The air was musty, thick with the scent of decay, and it felt like we had entered a time capsule from decades past. We explored the first floor, finding nothing but dust-covered furniture and the remnants of a life long abandoned. It wasn't until we reached the stairs leading to the basement that the real sense of dread set in. The door to the basement was closed, but a faint light flickered from underneath. "Who's going first?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I don't know why I volunteered. Maybe it was the stubborn need to prove I wasn't scared, or maybe it was something else, something deeper that I didn't quite understand. But I went first, pushing open the door and descending into the darkness. The basement was cold, and naturally so, and the light we'd seen was coming from a single, flickering candle placed on a rickety table in the center of the room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, their contents murky and unidentifiable. But it was the symbols carved into the floor that caught my attention, intricate, ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. Jake and Emily followed me down, their faces pale in the dim light. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. As if on cue, the candle suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness. We heard a low, guttural sound, like the growl of something alive. My heart pounded in my chest as we scrambled for our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness to reveal the shelves. But something was different now. The jars that had been still moments ago were now shaking, rattling against the wood as if something inside was trying to get out. "Let's get out of here," Jake said, his voice trembling. None of us argued. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind us. But as we reached the front door of the farmhouse, we froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into our souls. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at us with a gaze so cold it made my blood run. I stopped without thinking. We darted past him, out into the night. The air outside felt different, heavier, like the darkness itself was pressing in on us. We ran, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the empty night, not stopping until we were far from the farm, the lights of our town visible in the distance. We never spoke about that night again. Not to each other, not to anyone, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I think about the man in the farmhouse. I wonder if he was real, or if he was something else, something from the other side, drawn to the rituals of a man who was long gone. All I know is that we were lucky. We walked away from Pumpkin Hollow, but something tells me that not everyone has been so fortunate. And every Halloween since, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back at me from the darkness. It was Halloween night, and my friends and I had gathered at Megan's house for our annual tradition, the Halloween Marathon. We were all horror movie enthusiasts, and every year, we'd challenge ourselves to watch the scariest films we could find, hoping to outdo the previous year. Megan's house was the perfect spot for this, an old Victorian house that creaked and groaned with every step, with dim lighting and heavy curtains that made it feel like the house itself was alive. The house was rumored to be haunted, of course. Every old house in town had some ghost story attached to it, but Megan had always shrugged off the idea, laughing at the thought of her house being the home to anything other than her family. That Halloween, though, things felt different. I can't explain it exactly, it was just a feeling that settled over me as soon as I stepped inside. The air was thick, and every shadow seemed a little too deep, every sound a little too sharp. We settled in, as usual, a pile of blankets and pillows on the floor, bowls of popcorn, and candy spread around us. Megan dimmed the lights until only the flicker of the TV illuminated the room. It was cozy, the perfect setup for a night of harmless scares. The first couple of movies passed without incident. We screamed at the jump scares, laughed at each other's reactions, and paused occasionally to debate the characters' poor choices. But then, around midnight, Megan suggested something new. "Hey," she said, a sly grin on her face, "have you guys ever heard of the mirror game?" We all looked at her, curious. Megan was always the one with the wild ideas, the one who wasn't afraid to push the limits of what was just a game. The mirror game. I repeated, "What's that?" "It's this old ritual," Megan explained. "You're supposed to do it at midnight on Halloween. You stand in front of a mirror, light a candle, and say your name 3 times. The legend goes that you'll see a shadowy figure in the mirror, but if you see it, you're supposed to blow out the candle immediately and walk away. If you don't, bad things happen." We all laughed nervously. It sounded like one of those silly urban legends, something designed to freak people out but ultimately harmless. "Come on," Megan urged, "let's try it. What's the worst that could happen?" Against my better judgment, I agreed. We all did. I'm not sure if it was the late hour, the exhaustion from hours of horror movies, or just the eerie atmosphere of the house, but none of us wanted to be the one to back out. Megan grabbed a small handheld mirror from a drawer, and we gathered in the living room, the only light now coming from a single candle she'd lit on the coffee table. She held the mirror up, her face reflected dimly in the glass. "Okay," she said, her voice a little shaky now. "I'll go first." We all watched as Megan took a deep breath and said her name 3 times. "Megan. Megan, Megan." For a moment, nothing happened. We all leaned in, squinting at the mirror. And then, just as I was about to exhale in relief, I saw it. A shadow. It was faint at first, just a smudge of darkness at the edge of the mirror. But then it grew, becoming more defined. It wasn't Megan's reflection, but something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in this world. "Blow it out," I whispered urgently. Megan's hand shook as she reached for the candle, but she did it. The flame extinguished with a soft hiss, and the room was plunged into darkness. We sat there in silence for a long moment, the only sound our breathing. Finally, Megan let out a nervous laugh. "See? Nothing to it, but something was wrong." The room felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the room, pressing in on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. We tried to laugh it off, to continue with the marathon, but the mood had changed. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made us jump. After another hour, we called it a night. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all spooked out as I gathered my things and headed for the door. I glanced at the mirror still sitting on the coffee table. For a split second, I thought I saw the shadow again, lurking just behind my reflection. I blinked, and it was gone. I left quickly after that, and we never spoke of the mirror game again. But I'll never forget the look in Megan's eyes that night, the way her hand trembled as she blew out the candle. Something happened in that house, something I can't explain, and to this day, I avoid mirrors after midnight. The first Halloween I spent at that old, creaky farmhouse was the last one I would ever willingly spend in a place like that. We had just moved to the small town of Blackwood, and the house an ancient, sprawling Victorian with an overgrown yard, and a fence missing several boards seemed like a dream come true for my twin brother, Danny, and me. It was big, it was old, and it was perfect for a pair of 15-year-olds with a knack for adventure. It was Halloween night, and the crisp autumn air had a bite to it. We had spent the day carving pumpkins and making ridiculous costumes out of whatever we could find. By dusk, the entire neighborhood was abuzz with trick-or-treaters, and the house was no exception. We had decided to forego the candy this year, instead opting to take part in the festivities ourselves. That evening, a cold wind howled through the house, sending shivers up my spine every time it whistled through the gaps in the old window panes. The wind seemed to carry whispers, like 1,000 voices murmuring just beyond my hearing. I thought it was just the draft playing tricks on me until I saw the first flicker of movement in the hallway, a shadow darting just out of sight. "Did you see that?" I asked Danny, my voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" he replied, adjusting his pirate hat. He was too busy eyeing his reflection in the hall mirror, perfecting his pirate swagger. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just nerves. We carried on, the excitement of Halloween overriding my growing unease. The night wore on, and the steady stream of trick-or-treaters slowed to a trickle. We decided to check out the attic, a place we hadn't yet explored. It was one of those cliché horror movie decisions, but curiosity got the better of us. The attic was dark and filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets. As we climbed up, the creaking of the stairs seemed unusually loud in the silence. When we finally reached the top, we fumbled for the light switch. The bulb flickered weakly before illuminating the attic's grim contents. We began to sift through the cobweb boxes, finding old photographs, yellowed letters, and strange, outdated clothing. It was fascinating until Danny knocked over a dusty trunk. The sound echoed loudly, and the temperature in the attic seemed to drop abruptly. "Whoa, look at this," Danny said, pulling out an old, weathered journal from the trunk. The cover was adorned with intricate patterns, and the pages were filled with faded ink. He started reading aloud, but the words were indecipherable, written in an archaic script. "Stop," I said, a chill running down my spine. "Something feels off." Before Danny could respond, the attic door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. My heart pounded as the heavy thud of the door locking echoed through the space. We pounded on the door, but it didn't budge. Panic set in as the whispers from earlier grew louder, forming coherent sentences that we couldn't quite understand. We were trapped. Danny pulled out his phone, using the flashlight to search for another way out. Our breaths were visible in the cold air, and the whispers seemed to swirl around us, growing louder and more frantic. Then, we saw a figure standing in the corner of the attic. It was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakable. The figure wore an old-fashioned outfit, resembling something from a bygone era. It slowly approached us, its presence chilling the very air. I could see its eyes, a hollow, dark void that seemed to pierce right through us. Danny grabbed my arm, his face pale with fear. "Stay back," Danny shouted, his voice trembling. The figure stopped abruptly, and the whispers suddenly ceased. In that eerie silence, we could hear the faintest sound of laughter, a child's laughter, echoing around us. The attic door creaked open on its own, and the figure slowly faded away. We bolted down the stairs, not stopping until we were outside, breathing heavily in the cold night air. We looked at each other, our faces ashen, and said nothing. We didn't need to. That night, we never spoke about the attic again, and we avoided the upstairs altogether. Years later, when we looked back, we never fully understood what happened. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear that child's laughter, drifting through the empty halls of that old farmhouse. Danny and I survived that Halloween, but the memory of the attic lingers like a shadow we can never quite escape. Halloween has always been my favorite time of the year. Growing up in a small New England town, it felt like the holiday was something sacred here. There was an air of mystery in the crisp autumn breeze, the kind of chill that made the hairs on your arms stand up for reasons you couldn't quite explain. Every year, our little town put together a haunted trail in the woods, something fun for the kids and teens to explore. But there was one part of the woods no one dared venture into, especially not on Halloween night. It was called the Whispering Woods. The town's elders warned us about it every year. They said it wasn't safe after dark, that the trees themselves seemed to speak in low, unintelligible murmurs if you got too close. They even had a rhyme for it, a little ditty meant to scare the kids. "Step too far where the shadows creep, the whispers call, and the woods won't sleep." We never took it seriously. I mean, who would? It was just a way to keep kids from getting lost, or so I thought. That Halloween night, 4 of us, me, my best friend Kyle, his girlfriend Emily, and my sister Sarah, decided we'd brave it. Not the whole woods, of course, just the edge. You know, enough to prove we weren't scared. We didn't tell anyone where we were going, figuring it would be better to just sneak off after the haunted trail wrapped up. The walk out to the Whispering Woods was eerily quiet. The leaves crunched beneath our feet. The wind rustled the branches, but other than that, there was a strange stillness. By the time we reached the boundary, the trail was deserted, and the full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "Just to the edge," Kyle replied confidently. "We'll stay where we can still see the trail." We crossed the invisible boundary where the trail faded into the dense thicket of trees. Immediately, something felt off. The air grew heavier, like we were stepping into a different world. The silence that had been so peaceful before now felt oppressive, like it was pressing in on us from all sides. As we ventured deeper, the whispers began. At first, it was faint, almost like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, As we moved further in, the sound grew clearer, soft, almost melodic voices, whispering just out of reach of understanding. We all froze, looking at each other to see if we were all hearing the same thing. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Kyle nodded, his bravado fading. "Yeah, it's just the wind." It has to be, but it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like voices, hundreds of them, all speaking at once but in a language none of us could understand. "Let's go back," Sarah urged, tugging on my sleeve. "This isn't right." Before we could decide, there was a loud snap behind us, like a branch breaking underfoot. We all spun around, but there was nothing there, just the dark outline of trees against the night sky. "Let's go," Kyle said, his voice barely more than a whisper. We turned to leave, but the way we had come seemed different now. The trees felt closer, their branches twisting together overhead like skeletal hands, blocking out the moonlight. We should have been able to see the trail from where we were, but it was gone, swallowed by the forest. Panic began to set in. We hadn't gone that far in, but now it felt like we were trapped. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around us like a living thing. "We have to stay calm," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We just need to retrace our steps." But as we started to walk, the whispers changed. They no longer seemed like random voices. They were saying something, repeating it over and over. It was still unintelligible, but there was a rhythm to it now, almost like a chant. Hal grabbed my arm. "Do you see that?" I followed his gaze to the edge of the clearing where a faint light flickered between the trees. It was pale, almost like a lantern swaying in the breeze, but there was no one holding it. We didn't move. None of us wanted to get closer to that light, but it seemed to be getting closer to us. Slowly, it drifted through the trees, weaving between the trunks like it was searching for something. "Run!" I shouted, but as we turned to sprint back the way we had come, the light flickered out, and the whispers stopped. Just like that, the woods were silent again. When we finally broke through the trees and back onto the trail, the familiar sights of the town's Halloween festival greeted us as if nothing had happened. People laughed and chatted, unaware of the terror we had just experienced. We never talked about it after that night. None of us ever went near the Whispering Woods again. I still don't know what we encountered, whether it was some trick of the mind or something more sinister. The fog had rolled in thick as I pulled up to the old Hawthorne estate, my headlights piercing only a few feet into the dense mist. It was Halloween night, and the estate was hosting its annual haunted house charity event, a tradition that had become something of a legend among locals for its eerie authenticity. My friends and I, thrill seekers and skeptics, had decided to see if the rumors of paranormal activity were true. "Ready for this?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with excitement and nerves. "Born ready," I replied, though I couldn't deny a shiver of apprehension. The place was notorious for its ghostly lore. They said that the original owner, Charles Hawthorne, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mansion filled with dark secrets. The front door creaked open as we approached, revealing an intricately decorated fort. Guttural groans and eerie whispers echoed through the hallways, adding to the atmosphere. We checked in and received our wristbands, which glowed faintly in the dim light. The house was a labyrinth of rooms, each more chilling than the last. We passed through rooms filled with unsettling mannequins and unsettlingly lifelike actors. The real fear, however, came when we entered the basement. Descending the creaky stairs, I noticed that the temperature seemed to drop significantly. Our breath fogged in front of us. Jake and Liz, our more skeptical friends, exchanged uneasy glances. "Guys, look at this," Liz whispered, pointing to a dusty mirror on the wall. The reflection showed not only us but something else, an ominous shadow hovering in the corner. "Probably just a trick of the light," Jake said, though he was clearly unsettled. We pressed on, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching us. The basement was filled with strange artifacts, old paintings, dusty furniture, and an antique rocking chair that seemed to sway gently. Though there was no draft. It was Liz who first noticed the door. Hidden behind a pile of old trunks, it was half open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended even further into the darkness. "Let's check it out," Jake said, his curiosity getting the better of him. The stairs creaked ominously as we made our way down. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, almost as if they were coming from just behind us. I turned to look, but saw only shadows dancing on the walls. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a small, musty room lined with shelves of old books and dusty artifacts. There was a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering intermittently. In the center of the room stood an old chest, its surface covered in intricate carvings. It seemed oddly out of place, as if it didn't belong in a haunted house. Liz hesitated but then said, "Let's open it." What's the worst that could happen? With some effort, we pried open the chest. Inside was a collection of old letters and a large, ancient-looking book. The letters were handwritten, detailing the life of Charles Hawthorne and his obsession with dark rituals. The book, bound in cracked leather, had a title embossed in gold, The Chronicles of the Unknown. Jake, ever the history buff, couldn't resist examining the book. As he flipped through the pages, a sudden chill swept through the room. The whispers grew louder, and the light bulb above us began to flicker wildly. Then, out of nowhere, the chest slammed shut on its own. We all jumped, but I noticed something strange: a figure in the corner of the room. It was a shadowy silhouette, almost as if it was made of the darkness itself. Did anyone else see that? I asked, my voice trembling. "Yeah, I saw it too," Liz said, her eyes wide with fear. The figure seemed to move closer, but as it did, the whispers grew deafening. The room seemed to close in on us. In a panic, we raced back up the stairs, the temperature rising with each step. When we reached the basement, the fog seemed to lift, and the whispers faded. We burst out of the house, breathing heavily. The Halloween night air never felt so refreshing. We glanced back at the mansion, the front door now firmly shut. No one spoke as we made our way to the parking lot, the eerie events of the night still sinking in. Despite our relief at escaping unscathed, the strange occurrences left a lasting impression. To this day, whenever Halloween comes around, I can't help but think of the Hawthorne estate, the shadowy figure, and the whispers that seemed to come from the very heart of the darkness. We all survived the night, but there's a lingering sense that something remains within those walls, waiting for the next group of thrill seekers to open the chest and awaken what lies in the depths of the Hawthorne estate.